Our next presenter would be Dr. Alberto Costa. Dr. Alberto is a senior researcher and cluster coordinator at the ETH Center, Future Resilient Systems. His research focuses on black box and robust optimization, clustering in complex networks, and information retrieval. His presentation today is titled Long-Term Solar PV Planning in High-Density Urban Systems. Dr. Alberto, please.
Thank you. So it's another presentation about solar energy in Singapore, only that this time the focus is more on the optimization and modeling. So some of these reasons for why we are doing this research has been shared previously, but Singapore has very ambitious solar PV target. By 2025, they would like to achieve 1.5 gigawatt, and by 2030, 2 gigawatt. And the main source that we analyze in this study is the rooftop and facade. What is the challenge here is that the space is scarce. And there is also competition for the space. For example, in the rooftop, you may want to put panels, but you may want to have some green area, so there is competition on that. And how can we achieve, or rather, how can the government and agencies achieve these targets knowing that there are these challenges? This is what we are trying to answer with this study. The approach we use is robust optimization. So we develop a robust optimization model to kind of forecast in the 2020 to 2050 the amount of capacity that Singapore can install. And to do that, what is the idea? We build a model, we calibrate with past data, existing data that we can find, and then we determine also something interesting from the analysis of the model. If we cannot get to the targets, what are the incentives that we need to give to people in order to achieve such targets? Here you can see something that has been shared already, the fact that from 2014 to 2019, this picture shows you the residential and non-residential solar capacity has been increasing a lot. So what are the assumptions of our model? Of course, there is the objective. What is the driving objective? And here we look at the economic surplus principle. That basically means there are buyers and sellers of these solar PV systems, and we want to maximize the total benefit for them. So the sellers may have a selling price, a minimum selling price in mind. The buyer, they also have a buying price, and the transaction price will give a benefit to both. We want to maximize that. We look, as I say, that Singapore in the 2020 to 2050 time frame, and we know that the space for rooftop and facade is limited. We also consider the consumers as risk averse, and this will be important later because we have to take into account uncertainty. And as I said, we have some parameters that we calibrate with past data, and the objective is to meet the targets by the agencies and government. So the optimization model that we build, as I said, the objective is to maximize this economic benefit for the stakeholders in the system. The constraints are the space availability. We cannot exceed the available space for rooftop and facade. And also, of course, an equilibrium between the amount of capacity that is sold and bought. When we have that, we can derive what is called robust counterparts. So we move from a robust optimization model to a model that we can solve with existing software, and then we can forecast this capacity in the period 2020 to 2050. And finally, we can analyze the solution to derive these incentives that we need to achieve the targets specified by agencies. Don't be scared about that. This is just to let you know what is the kind of optimization model we are talking about. And just this is the constraint where we want to satisfy the target. So we just quickly change that. But just for you to know that there is an optimization modeling behind. Now, the background is Singapore. We use it because, as shared before, there is a very good potential for the solar. And then we look at this facade and rooftop. For the rooftop, we consider the 5 regions in Singapore and 3 consumer types, residential, commercial, and industrial. For the facade, because we don't have enough past data for the calibration, we consider a single profile. Data are taken mostly from the EMA and the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore. They published 2 reports in 2014-2020 with information like available space, projection for the price of panels, and so on. Now, the first step, as I said, is calibrating the model. So what we did, we took the data from 2014 to 2018, and we ran our model, fixing the parameters that we don't know in such a way that the prediction of our model, that are the blue lines, are as close as possible to the real data, that is the red line. As close as possible in the residual minimization terms, if you are familiar, but basically means the line should be as close as possible. These here represent the non-residential consumers, and then we use the 2019 just to see if the model was good enough. I mentioned that we have uncertainty, so in this slide I will just quickly show you why that is important, because if we don't have uncertainty, what happens is that the buyers will decide to buy everything, so use all the space at the most convenient time period, that in this case is 2020. The top figure means install everything at the beginning and then nothing else. But when you have uncertainty, the prediction of the model on the bottom are more realistic, so there is an adoption that is increasing. That is what we would expect. Okay, what are the results? Can we achieve the targets? No. So this is what the model is telling us. If we just run the model with the data that we have, you see this picture, the 2 dots, the 2 purple dots are the targets I mentioned earlier in 2025, 2030, and the blue line is the capacity that is predicted or forecasted by our model. So we cannot achieve that. How can we achieve that? Well, we analyze the solution and we derive the incentive, so Singapore dollar for kilowatt installed, that we need to give to consumer, so that it's more convenient for them to install more. And if we do that, then yes, we can achieve the targets. Here you can see the amount of money. We have 3 scenarios. If we want to achieve the 2025, the 2030, or both of them. And you see the amount of money, again, this is Singapore dollar for kilowatt, we need to give for each year. Another interesting thing I want to mention is this. We notice some relationship between these results and resilience. So look at this picture. The green line is basically the business as usual, what the model predicts. And then we say, well, what will happen if there is a sudden increase in the selling price, a shock? For example, you know, with the commodity price increase after the war, this could happen. And we're talking about 30 years. Many things can happen. So if there is in our simulation a 50% increase, you see that the solar adoption, the capacity installed, is going down, and then it's picking up again. But if there is an 80%, then it's basically collapsing. And this is similar to what you see when you analyze resilience, when after a shock you can have a decrease and then you go back to normal, or if the shock is too big, you can have a collapsing behavior. So this means that potentially there can be a study where we try to understand better this model using concept taken from resilience. To summarize, we derive a model based on robust optimization. Space constraints are included, risk aversion of consumer as well, for forecasting the solar adoption in Singapore in the medium to long term. And this model, we are not saying that take this and trust this. No, it's just a decision support tool that agencies can use and complement with other requirements. Like, for example, the budget that we say is necessary, maybe is not available. So they need to check with other things. But this can give another perspective on this problem. We have a paper recently published on that. If you want more information, all the details, the model is there. And if it's not enough, just write me and I will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alberto, for your presentation on solar PV planning. Next up, we have Professor Cheong Siew An. Professor Cheong is an associate professor at the Nanyang Technological University and principal investigator at FCL Global. His research focuses on developing data analysis methods and toy models for understanding the dynamics of complex systems. His presentation today is titled Cities as Social Reactors. Prof. Cheong, please.
So let me stand over there as well, since I understand that the platform creaks except around here. Oh, or the pointer. Good. Okay, so as I listened to the talks, I suddenly got worried that I'm in the wrong panel. Okay, and the reason for that is because this is my first time hearing about the term regenerative. Okay, I think I understand sustainability, but I understand it in a different way, probably from those of you who are in the audience. So let me preface these two terms before I go on to give the talks, because then it will not sound so strange, the things I'm talking about. So first, from the complex systems perspective, sustainable means robust and also resilient. So robust means that you have feedbacks present in the system to allow you to lock into one particular state even though your environment is changing and very noisy. And resilient means that you have the processes in place in the complex system to recover from shocks, provided they are not so big that they destroy all the processes. So now, I think with those things set aside, I can start talking about cities and social reactors and explain why this is relevant to this particular panel. Okay, so first, oops, too fast. Okay, so first, this first slide is titled Signals and Boundaries. So I want to talk about, because the title of my talk is reactions. So I have to first explain a little bit why reactions are important from the perspective of complex systems. So first of all, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the theory of how life started on this particular planet. So well, we know that our planet consists of a lot of different of the light elements. Of course, they do not exist in their present form in the early days, but there was a lot of rain and there's lightning and some of the primitive amino acids are created in this kind of lightning storms. And then, of course, they get settled into the oceans. But you do not expect life to form spontaneously from this primordial soup, because it takes too long for the amino acids to actually encounter each other to form a chemical bond. Okay? But we also know that liquids that contain lots of this kind of dirt tends to form a lot. So of course, we don't like dirt, but dirt is actually already formed long-chain molecules that may have a polar end as well as an organic end. And this tends to organize by themselves, so no external intervention is needed into something called a micelle. So this traps some liquid inside, and also and of course this micelle will float around in the primordial soup, and within this trapped volume, because there's a boundary, the path that is between the amino acids become greatly shortened. So now you can have reactions inside the micelle itself. So that's what I mean by the chemical reaction is fast inside and it's slow in the soup. Okay? And of course, as time goes on, the micelles also evolve. Eventually, they become cells. So that's the picture there. I don't know whether there's a laser pointer. No. Okay? So the cells, of course, if you compare the structure of a cell, you see that it's just a very complicated version of a micelle with a more robust cell wall that actually looks like the inorganic and polar molecules that form the micelle in the first place. And of course, cells can aggregate to form tissues. And in so doing, they can actually have chemical reactions within the cell, have chemical reactions that are triggered by another cell. So there can be intracellular as well as extracellular signaling. And that leads to a hierarchy of timescales which actually is needed by life. Now, why do I want to talk about cells and biological life? Because I want to now bring your attention to the parallel between biological life and urban life. Of course, we know that when we were still hairy, but not live on trees anymore, we live in dispersed groups. So the interactions between us, except for the small community that we belong to, is kind of slow because the next community may be, say, 20, 30 kilometers away, and unless I have a reason, I do not travel that kind of distance within a day, so I never meet with the neighboring groups. But after a while, our ancestors discovered agriculture, and they tend to now form small settlements. So the small settlements, the same number of people or a larger number of people, now they can interact much faster. Although they spend most of the day in the fields growing the crops, so there's not much interaction except with nature, which is fine. But there is now also a lot more social interactions, and then fast forward to today, you have large cities where the social interactions is at a rate that is unimaginable. If you are a resident of a small village, you can't imagine that, wow, there's a person who can do so many different things, like, for example, be present at this panel at Symposium, and those kind of things that we take for granted because we live in large cities. Now, let me now go back to the term regenerative a little bit. So I mentioned that in complex systems, you must have first the feedbacks, you must have the processes in order to be robust and sustainable. And regenerative is where you now throw in evolution. So obviously, large part of biological evolution is blind. There is nothing really directing it. But of course, we are not blind ourselves. So we can think about how to, well, not drive, but maybe we can think about how we can steer the evolution of social interaction in such a way that we can move on to the next stage. So biologically, the next stage is actually the brain, which is one of the most complex organs in the universe. And I suspect that if we can somehow make cities denser, and speed up the social interaction, we will end up with something that is the urban equivalent of a brain. Now, how would you know if you're already living in one or not yet? Very simple. Just ask yourself, I'm in Singapore. Does being in Singapore give me something that is likened to a religious experience? If yes, then we are there. Okay, I don't have that feeling yet, so maybe we're not there yet. So now let me move on to the next set of slides and talk about social reactions. So these are the coherent social interactions that we can identify and give names to. Well, first of all, between individuals in Singapore, we can have linguistic interactions. And of course, the purpose of the linguistic interaction is actually to buy chicken rice. Please conclude soon. Okay, good. So I can now move on to why the purpose of our module, and that is to intensify the urban interactions in such a way that we will get to do more, but not just more of the same, but more of different types, and in such a way that we can maximize individual potentials, but at the same time use less land, less time, less energy, and less whatever it is that we like to save on. And this is our team from Module D4. We are organized into 3 work packages. Marcus and Lock Yu leads the urban data analytics together and works together with Dr. Tong. Then I work together with Peter Egger and Dr. Aina. And then there's Felicity, who is in work package 3 on urban planning and policy, works together with Patricia as well as Wei Jing. So I think I can answer questions if you will find this interesting later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chong, for your presentation on cities as social reactors. Next speaker, we have Dr. Pratik. He's the last speaker for today before our panel discussion. Dr. Pratik is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore and principal investigator at FCL Global. His research focuses on creating methodological innovations at the intersection of Bayesian machine learning, econometrics, causal inference, and computational psychology. His presentation is titled today, Adaptive Planning of Charging Infrastructure for Electric Vehicles. Dr. Pratik, please.
Thank you, Alberto, for already setting the stage for little bit mathematical presentations. But I'm not going to bore you at this moment with a lot of mathematical equations. But what we are going to focus today is how can we design the electric vehicle charging infrastructure in an adaptive way. And this is very related to our theme of our module, which is adaptive mobilities, infrastructure, and land use, where we try to look at the interaction between the mobility and the land use. And we've planned infrastructures so that we can account for future uncertainties. So this will be kind of a flavor of the kind of things that we are doing. Our module started around 7-8 months ago, properly in a full-fledged way. So a lot of work is work in progress. So I'm going to give a lot of ideas about the frameworks that we are developing and the kind of results that we can expect out of it. So with that, we know that I think there is a lot of excitement about electric vehicles, and there are aims across the globe that, okay, we want to achieve full electric vehicle fleet in maybe 2030 or 2050. 2050 is even later. I think most European countries and China and America, I guess all are thinking that between 2030 and 2040, we want to achieve the full electrification. And the fundamental thing to achieve electrification is to really having a solid charging infrastructure. And it's growing rapidly. If we think about the Singaporean vision, I think the LTA also plan to have around 60,000 electric vehicle charging points by 2030. And they want to make the entire fleet to be electric by 2040. So this is an ambitious, I think this is an ambitious agenda to get these charging infrastructure running, but it's also a very complex problem because charging infrastructure is a very multidimensional problem in terms of a decision making. So we have to think about when, where, and in what capacity of chargers do we put conditional on the charging infrastructure that we already have. So it becomes a very complex problem because it also has interaction with the other systems. So if you look at the charging infrastructure, if you build more charging infrastructure, EV adoption will increase, and electric mobility patterns will be different in that situation, and that will also affect the charging infrastructure. And that's not there yet. We also have to account for various uncertainties. It's possible that the battery technology can improve in the future. Maybe the land use changes happen because we are in the world where people like to do work from home. So the mobility patterns will also change. So I think it's important to acknowledge the fact when we are designing the infrastructure that we are designing today's infrastructure for future. And that's where the adaptive planning mindset comes into the picture. And to this end, what we are proposing is a framework, or we can say it as a planning decision support system, where we can kind of deploying the charging infrastructure in the multiple stages and at an urban scale while accounting for EV adoption and the mobility pattern interaction of the charging infrastructure, accounting for various uncertainties that may exist into the land use as well as the battery technology and the various spatial constraints. So when we talk about the spatial constraints, it means that in a specific land, we can only put only this much amount of charging infrastructure. Or there might be several other constraints about, from the policy perspective, and the supply side constraints, how do we account for those constraints? So to put this idea into perspective, what we do is we first create the spatial units in the whole urban area. In current situation, it's Singapore. So you can see a lot of hexagon spaces in there. And what we plan to do is, then the problem becomes, let's say we consider a planning horizon of 1 month or 1 year. That also depends on the planning horizon of the agencies, local agencies who want to plan the charging infrastructure at a different horizon. And what we do is, based on the state at each planning horizon of the system, we decide whether the taking a specific action gives the higher expected rewards in the future or not. And this idea is very common in the multi-stage optimization and the reinforcement learning. So what we do is we decide after 1 year or 1 month how many charging points of what type do we put in each of these spatial units. That's our decision variable of the problem. But what we do is we account for the future expected reward while we make this decision. Okay? So this is a very complex problem where we need to account for the interactions and the uncertainty at the same time. So to handle this problem, what we do is we created the 3 modules. And another simplification that we are doing here is we are solving charger problem mainly for the fast charging infrastructure. Right? So when we are solving this problem for the fast charging infrastructure, we are only looking at the ride-hailing demand. So when we are looking at the ride-hailing demand, this is the one module which is mainly focusing on the ride-hailing simulations. The other module, which is the trip synthesis module, which is mainly focusing on the mobility patterns. And the third module is the decision-making module, which connects with all these 2 other modules. And finally decides that in which spatial unit, how many charging infrastructure need to be put of specific type in a specific planning horizon. So I'll just quickly talk about the objective functions, but you don't need to worry about the equations, but what goes in the equation is more important. So in terms of when we define the reward, we need to figure out how do we define that reward, and we consider the multiple components. Obviously, it can be increased, but it's a framework which allows us to incorporate multiple other components. So we include the revenue from charging, electricity cost, maintenance cost, and the setup cost of the new charger. And one thing which is important to acknowledge that we have these rewards in the future, right? So we need to discount them when we want to look at the value in the current time. So we discount these rewards at the specific planning horizon when we are making the decision. And in terms of uncertainties, we account for 2, which is battery technology and also more of how the trip mobility patterns will be affected by installing the charging infrastructure itself. So we look at the induced demand and the induced changes in the trip patterns as well. And finally, as I've been talking about, the action is number of type of Q chargers, and type Q can be anything. I mean, this framework works for the slow and the fast chargers, but there can be categories even in the fast chargers. There can be turbochargers and little bit slower fast chargers. And that needs to be deployed at the location in a specific planning period. That's our objective, that's our decision variable. And when we think about the states that I've been talking about, that we need to account for the state, current state, as well as the expected reward of that action. So when we talk about the state, we can define state based on 2 things. One is basically how much is the satisfaction or the current level of service of the charging infrastructure, and the second aspect is how much is it unused. So we look at the charging demand satisfaction rates as well as the occupancy rates and the waiting time ratios. So it's both aspects that it should not be underutilized and the overutilized. So we account for these aspects when we define the state. And initially, the model is a bit fluctuating, but we see that it converges in the end. And if you want to look at the results, this is how the results will look like. This is not the final result, but this is just a depiction of how the results will look like. So what happens is, let's say if you look at the 12th month of each year, you have X number of chargers. At that point, we'll solve this problem. We look at what is the expected reward. Based on that, we take a decision that how many chargers to include at the end of the 12th month of each year, and the chargers accumulates. We can also account for dismantling of the chargers in this framework, because we don't need to make much changes to the framework to account for that. Thank you. And happy to provide you more details if you send me an email on this ID. Thank you.